Good evening and welcome to the second talk in our new series, Making the Past Our Present, delivered by the Irish Baroque Orchestra in partnership with the National Concert Hall. My name's Alia Cornish, and as CEO of the Irish Baroque Orchestra, I'm delighted that you've joined us this evening. There will be a question and answer session at the end, so please feel free to submit any questions that you might have in the chat or comment functions, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the time that we have available. I'm joined this evening by IBO's principal double bass player, Malachy Robinson. The word versatile probably doesn't go far enough to describe Malachy's many and varied skills and talents. He's a founding member of the Irish Baroque Orchestra and Crash Ensemble, for whom he is a resident conductor. He is also principal double bass of the Irish Chamber Orchestra. During one of 2020's early lockdowns, I think I saw a video in circulation online of him singing and playing the banjo, and a recent review in the Journal of Music referred to him as a veritable groove machine. He appears with the IBO on June the 10th in a programme entitled Rejoice, Music to Lift the Spirit, which will be live streamed as part of the NCH's Spring Summer Variations series. I'm joined by Malachy now. Welcome.
Hi there.
Good evening. It's lovely to see you and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Over to you.
Over to me. Well, I'm sitting here at home in my music room where over the last year and a half I've spent a lot of time. But then again, my wife Anita is also a violinist and also a member of the Irish Baroque Orchestra. So the music room is in great demand. Luckily, our son Fiacre, who sleeps upstairs, has moved out. He's gone to Cork because he's an intern somewhere else now. So that room is now no longer a bedroom, and that's full of instruments and music as well. And luckily also our broadband can take several connections all at once. So anyway, welcome to my music room. It's full of stuff. The thing above my head, because you're going to want to know, or at least I would if I was you, that there is the case for one of the double basses, and it goes up there because there's nowhere else to put it. There's so much stuff. And today I'm going to talk to you specifically about 4 instruments and the role that I play with them. And so I might as well introduce you to the instruments. Why not? We'll start with the grumbliest. Why not? Okay. So here is a double bass, and this is, I'm going to come back over here. This is a pretty conventional looking double bass. Anybody who has met a double bass will recognize this. There's not much different about this from a modern instrument. In fact, there's nothing different because it is a modern instrument. This is a brand new bass made about 10 years ago. The shiny tuners up here, these geared tuners, make it look very modern. But the main difference with this is that the strings are gut. So the strings have a kind of these gut strings. I suppose I should explain. They're made out of the guts of animals, either normally cows or rams. I'm told it's rams and not sheep. I don't know why that is. Anyway, ram gut is very good. I have tried both ram and beef, and the ram tastes. No, it doesn't. No, the ram works much better. It just seems to last longer and be more stable. Anyway, that one there might take about the guts of maybe 50. Apparently, that one might be like 100, maybe 160 guts, so I'm told. And then this bottom string, I'm going to admit to you now, is a cheat. The bottom string on this bass is a modern string. So the other 3 are entirely gut with no metal at all. They're tuned the same as modern double bass strings. And the bottom one, the low E, there are historical strings available, and I have tried them, and I have had a nightmare with them. They're gut at the center, and they are spun with round wire, unlike these modern ones which are spun with flat wire, kind of a tape, so that they feel smooth. The historical ones are spun with round wire, like a guitar string. So when you shift on it, you hear, you'll be familiar with that from classical guitar. Anyway, that round winding, if you're unlucky like me, it will come loose. And what happens when it comes loose Probably when it comes loose, it's because the gut at the center has shrunk just a tiny bit. Then the metal winding will spin around the thing. So when you move your bow across it, instead of getting this noise, you might get this kind of a noise. Like nothing at all, because the winding is spinning around and the string itself is not moving. Now this happened to me just before a concert with the Irish Baroque Orchestra. In fact, I think it was called Christchurch Baroque back then. With Joshua Rifkin conducting, visiting, you know, celebrity type. And I had 2 wound strings on the bass, the bottom 2, which is common. People do this. And one or maybe even both of them, because of the humidity or temperature, the winding came loose. So I was moving the bow and nothing's happened. So anyway, it happened before the gig, and I had time to get some modern strings and stick them on there, and did the gig with unsuitable strings entirely on the bottom 2. Anyway, since then, my investigations have shown that metal winding on the bass strings was a kind of special thing and expensive, and not common. The most common wound string on all of the string instruments was the bottom string of the cello, the C string on the cello. Violins may do without wound strings. It works fine to have all. It's the bottom string. If it's not metal wound on a violin, it's really quite thick, and so it's not as clear. And you won't find many even Baroque violinists playing with an unwound, that is to say, a plain gut G string, the bottom string. But cellos, right through their history, going back to the end of the 17th century when the cello was invented, a primary feature of the violoncello is that the bottom string was wound with metal, allowing it to be thinner and shorter and still produce that low pitch. And the reason it can do that is because the metal adds weight, and so you have effectively a denser, heavier string, even though it's shorter and thinner. So the cello is by definition to be strung with a wound bottom string. If it doesn't have a wound C string, you could say it's not a cello. And so the cellos made by Antonio Stradivarius, who you will have heard of, the earliest ones he made were with 3 strings. You could argue they're not cellos at all. Certainly at this stage, any that survive have been converted to 4 strings. I can't say how many or if any, perhaps they all got smashed up or used for firewood. But it is true that he made 3-string cellos first, because that business of the 4th string, the metal wound C string, was a major factor. I'm going to come back to that later, but I'm going to, for now, just talk about this bottom string, that a low E was always a hypothetical part of the double bass tuning. These instruments here, this one and this one here, these are viola-da-gambas. I'm going to get to them in a bit. They're tuned in fourths like a guitar, and the bass is tuned in fourths like a guitar, or like a gamba more exactly. Because of a kind of relationship there, you'll also notice that the double bass has these sloped shoulders, which is like most viola-da-gambas, but confusingly not like this one. Just to show you that there is no absolutes. In fact, there are no absolutes anywhere, and by the end of me talking to you, I hope that I will have done a good job of making you more confused than you started, because that is the fact of historically informed performance. So getting back to my strings, the bottom string, if you have an instrument tuned in fourths, starting with a G at the top, then it will go down in fourths to D and to A, and the bottom one will be D. And you will read in treatises from the 17th century, from the 18th century, examples of theorists and musicological writers saying that this is a tuning for the double bass. But it seems likely, and again, nothing is certain, and somebody else would tell you I'm wrong, which is fine, but it seems, as far as I can tell, likely that this low E was almost never found. And a lower D was also a theoretical possibility, particularly if you had a 6th string bass tuned an octave lower than this, the bottom string being a D. The bottom string on an octave lower instrument would be a low D, a note lower than that. These exist in books, but the likelihood of these instruments being found is extremely rare, it seems. There may have been some of them. But one of the factors in why they would have been so rare is that the really big instruments were not generally owned by players. They were owned by institutions, the church. You know, the church owned the organ, the player didn't own the organ. The church also owned the bass. And so when a player showed up to play, also in an opera, they would play the bass that was there. They wouldn't bring their bass. I think this has to do with, you know, relative levels of income these days. Everybody can afford an instrument. Everyone can afford a car. If you imagine that going back to the 17th century, the idea of owning the equivalent of a car would have been beyond most people. Similarly, owning a double bass was something that you wouldn't even consider. And even to this day, there are instruments that players don't own. It's very rare, for example, to find, not very rare, but quite rare, to find a bassoonist who owns a contrabassoon. Because if they work with an orchestra, the orchestra will own the contrabassoon and the player will play it. And it may be in rag order, it may be falling apart and the keys falling off, and if it makes a rattly sound like a blocked drain, you know, you just cope with that. But that would have been the way with bass players showing up to play the bass in the church or in the court or in the opera house, until players' incomes rose, or unless the player themselves were particularly wealthy. So where was I going with that? Well, I'm still talking about the strings. So the very large instruments were very expensive to make. I think proportionally these days violins command higher prices than double basses because of the market that's there. But I think in those days it was the other way around, because violins, the market was not so elevated, and double basses obviously require more wood, more materials, and more hours of labor. And so that's another reason why players themselves wouldn't have owned them. Now, if I can just show you what you're more likely to have found, I'll put this one over here. Here you go. You might be more likely to have come across something like this. And this one only has 3 strings on it. On the bottom string is your G, and so is the top string, and the middle string is a D. And this seems a very common tuning, or at least if you had 3 strings, you might tune them with a fourth from the bottom to the middle one, and another fourth going down to an A, which would be like the top 3 of that one there, and in fact like the top 3 strings of a modern double bass. But with a piece of plain gut like this, let me just come up close to show you this one. So this one here, that thick string there, I mean that's really, really thick. It's about the thickness of a pencil, a thin pencil, but a pencil, a pen perhaps. Anyway, I'm told that perhaps 200 guts would have gone into that string. Now that sounds mad, but so I'm told. I've read it somewhere, and I've also been told it by somebody else, but maybe they read it. Maybe they read it in the same place. This is the problem with taking anybody's word for anything. You don't know where it came from. Like I said, I'm here to confuse you. So the bottom string here, when I bought this string, I got in touch with George in Manchester, the string maker, and I said, can I have the thickest string you have, please? And he said, well, I've got a good thick one here. Would you like it? I said, sure thing. And it's so different from a modern idea. The modern idea of buying strings is that you would buy a string for a particular pitch, and really specifically as well. And if you're going to tune to 440 or 415, you would, that is to say, the different A tunings frameworks. You wouldn't just tune a string to a tone higher or lower, and you wouldn't just buy a string and then find out what note it happens to give you. But in this case, I wanted to avoid the spinning metal winding issue. So I said, I'm not going to use metal wound strings anymore. My research tells me that metal winding, which was made of silver and was specially for cello strings, which are much shorter and thinner, if you silver wind with I mean, remember that pre-industrial revolution, making silver wire itself was an expensive business. It's made of silver, that's expensive, and a lot of it to go around this string, the entire length of it. That was too much for any player to invest in, and even for a church or a court. why would you bother if you can make do with plain gut? So plain gut is cheaper and works all the way down to about this pitch, which is a G. That's about the thickest string I could find, and it goes to a G. It would work for an A. It might work for an F. It would be a bit too floppy to work very well. And at an E, which is, like I say, the theoretical pitch of that bottom string, it doesn't really work. And that's what pretty much anybody would find. One of the problems we face with historical research and historical playing is that we only have the word of the theorists. We don't have the actual instruments with strings, because even if the instruments survive, and a lot of them didn't, particularly basses which weren't prized by an individual but belonged to an institution, therefore could be easily forgotten about, we don't have the strings. The strings don't survive. And even if they did survive, we wouldn't know what they were tuned to. So you can see the problem there. But we do know that this is the material that they were using, and this is the length of the instruments, roughly. And so it looks like a bottom G is low enough. And you do also see in the theorists often have access to grind and points to make, and sometimes when pretending to be reporting what was the practice, they're in fact espousing a theory that they fancy and would like to be adopted by players, but presenting it as if it was already a habit or a pattern or an established thing. So anyway, so this three-string bass has a G at the bottom and at the top. Bit confusing for fingering patterns because you can't go over the strings. There's a kind of a gap there, so C sharp is a long way up before you get to D, and that's all good clean fun. It's great for arpeggios, or you can do those straight away octaves. Even you could do those. And this bow, I might as well mention this bow while we're here. This bow is of a pattern that you will see in paintings going back as far as you like. The one thing that you might not see is this attractive screw, a brass screw, which is to tighten and loosen the thing. And the brass screw, and indeed the metal slide, which is in the interface between the frog and the stick, give it away as being probably around about the beginning of the 20th century, would you believe? Very hard to believe that anybody was playing with a thing like this. But apparently so. Apparently so. If it works, you know, it takes a long time to change. And the fashions that were rampant amongst high-flying string players of the violin and cello didn't always filter down to the bass. The bass is a kind of a slightly different proposition. I'm just going to adjust this here. And also, the leading bass player in the first half of the 19th century was a man called Domenico Dragonetti, and this bow is still named after him largely and called the Dragonetti bow. He worked in England and he made a fortune living in England for 50 years, living in a hotel in Piccadilly. But because he used this bow and he was in Britain and so celebrated, his influence was still being felt by the beginning of the following century. And so that's why this bow would be placed. But anyway, the point is that it works for me and it works for the Baroque orchestra because it is of a type, a pattern, a size, a length, you know, as much as we can tell. And the bow hole that you use hanging underneath it that you see in lots of paintings. An interesting thing to mention, speaking of paintings and how we have to glean our technique from paintings, both in paintings and in writings about double bass even up to the early 18th century, it was normal to wear a glove on your left hand, a buckskin glove to protect the fingers because it was hard work. And you can imagine especially it was hard work if the strings were a little rough. We don't know for sure how, if you leave gut strings on for a long time, they do become rougher. And especially if they're not being played regularly, the little barbs appear. As you can imagine. And yes, so the buckskin glove protected the player's fingers. And another thing I might as well mention at this point is that the player who played the double bass in the 17th or early 18th century was probably not a double bass player. I have some fantastic light on these instruments. It's like hallelujah around here. Amazing. This is just the daylight coming in. Magic. So hallelujah. So anyway, in Bach's, let's talk about Bach, because everybody knows Bach. So when Bach was in Leipzig, in his mature period, and there was this music school there, the Thomas Schule, and we know what went on there because the records were all kept. And we know that the double bass was not taught there as a primary instrument. It may not have been taught at all. That is to say, there may not have been a teacher as such. In fact, I'd say that's the case. I should know this, but like I say, mostly I'm here to confuse you. But I do know that the double bass was not taught as a primary instrument. So nobody would have called themselves a double bass player. That's the point. So you'd be a musician, and you might play, of your own free will, you might prefer to play the oboe, but maybe somebody else is better at that. And you're still a musician, you'll get a job doing something. The double bass would be a thing that if you had any knack at all, remember, you wouldn't own it, and you may not ever have had any real lessons in it. And you would have been given a glove to protect your hand because it's hard work. And also your fingers will be soft if you're not really used to playing the double bass a lot. My fingers are kind of like the heels of your feet is what my fingers are like, because I play the bass every day. They're not even hard anymore. Like your heels are kind of, I mean, most of the time, your heels they're kind of softish, but just very thick. Well, that's what my fingers are like. But you would need to do that. So the glove helps you with that. The other factor, if you don't play the double bass as a primary instrument, is you will not be able to play with great facility, and it's very well established that bass players simplified their parts. This is really confusing, and again, nobody has answers. We have kind of answers, we have questions, we have theories, and so let's just, seeing as we're here now, let's just take a moment to talk about Bach and the Brandenburg concertos, because I'm sure you will have heard them. In fact, the IBO are going to be playing them later this year. Look out for them in the National Concert Hall in the autumn. Anyway, the Brandenburg concertos is also what I was playing with Joshua Rifkin that time when my strings started spinning. But these are great pieces, 6 pieces in a set, highly prized at the time. They were delivered as a set to a patron. So they weren't functional music just to provide background music or anything like that. They were a set, an artifact. And, okay, what am I going to say about the Brandenburg concertos? Let me think for a moment. I have them here. And this is the original, no, this is just... This is a nice score by Dover. Yes, that's a lifetime. So if we know that the bass player who played for Bach was not, I can't say, I'm not going to say I'm certain, but I'm pretty certain that that the player was not primarily a bass player. We certainly know this about the cantatas. In one of the cantatas, the double bass part, some of the cantatas you see, we have parts, not only scores, but parts. And these are really interesting because they reveal sometimes things that the scores don't. And in one of the cantatas, where there are parts, there's a specific bass part written out for the bass. And on the other side, for one of the movements, is the second horn part, second French horn. Now, the double bass part doesn't include the movement that has the horn. And the horn, so it's not a movement that is also represented on both sides. Quite clearly, the same player would turn the page and put down the double bass and play the French horn. This would be most unlikely these days. I don't think, in fact, you're not going to get that. So you're a musician, you know, you don't get to play French horn, you don't get to play first horn, you know, because maybe you're not that good, but maybe you like the horn, you can play second horn. But you've got to be used for something, so they give you the bass, and if you're not too rubbish at it, you get asked to do it again. That's my life. Yeah, well, that's why I took up the double bass. They needed a bass in the youth orchestra. I was a late starter. I had to pick something they needed. There you go. I would have been useful to Bach too. And so in the Brandenburgs, people argue about these because it's a beautiful set of 6. And they seem to be written for orchestral forces. Let's look at number 2. Why not? We can refer to number 1. At the beginning of number 1, which is the one that contains French horns, it says violone grosso, continuo e violone grosso. That's what it says in the score on the bottom line. So continuo is where we are today. That's right, that's what I'm supposed to be talking about, continuo. And continuo e violone grosso. So the continuo part is the one that where the harmony resides. The bass line and numbers above those bass notes to tell you what chords to play. Kind of the same as in a jazz rhythm section. You have the chord symbols. You know, A7, D, E half diminished, etc. And so in Baroque times, the rhythm section was the continuo section. And the line called continuo is played by many instruments. Let's stick to the Brandenburgs for now. So Bach was quite specific about his instrumentation and what he wants on this continuo line in number 1 is the keyboard, which would have been a harpsichord because it's chamber music, not church music, and the violone grosso. Now that means double bass. Violone is a term that means a big viol. That's a viol. That's also a viol. Violone means a big viol, but actually these are violones because they're big. They're viols and they're big. They're not as big as this. So this is called a violone grosso, a big one. So in number 1, Bach is asking apparently for a double bass, which plays an octave lower than these ones. In number 2, however, he's asking for a violone. And without the word grosso, he doesn't write that. He did write it in number 1. And yet, in the Brandenburg second concerto, you will have heard it, with forces that include solo trumpet, which it's written for, and recorder, which is written for, solo violin, which it's written for. Then you have a first violin section, a second violin section, a double bass, very often, and then the cello plays the same line as the keyboard, and it says it here, violoncello e cembalo are the continuo line. Bach is specific about that. But violone di ripieno, that is the violone that's in the orchestra. So the violin 1 section, violin 2, the viola, and the violone. If he meant it to be a double bass, would he not have written violone grosso as he did in number 1? I guess he would have. I mean, they were presented as a set. It was a set. And yet, people assume that it's a double bass because our modern ears expect to hear a double bass. There's a cello playing with the keyboard. So we have a cello. We have the violin 1, 2, viola. Surely we need a double bass. Well, let's see. So this here, here's what this sounds like on the double bass. Sounds okay, you know. I mean, it's grumbly, but that's, you know, grumbly is good, especially when you have all these other instruments above it. But he didn't say violone grosso. He just said violone. And so probably he meant this. It's a bit different. So this is a large gamba. And why would he want that when it's at the same pitch as the cello? Well, first of all, this is tuned as a G violone, a G viol, which is the lowest pitch of the normal viola-da-gamba family. And because it's the lowest pitch, the G pitch, it's an octave below what we call the tenor viol, and a fifth below what we call the bass viol. That makes it violone, not a viol, but a violone, because one means big, just like ino means small. Like violino is a small viol, although it belongs to another family. Like I said, I'm here to confuse you. So violone means the big viol. And why would he want this when he has a cello also playing the same pitches? Well, the reason for this could be that the cello, very much in fashion, was both nimbler and more powerful than this instrument, and had become, by this period, pretty much ubiquitous for Continuo. So you will have seen almost anytime you will see the Irish Baroque Orchestra play, you will see the cello and keyboard going hell for leather all the way through everything, while other people come and go. And this is a pattern that was started around this time. Whereas the violone was an older instrument. Like I said, the cello only arrived with the invention of this technology for string winding in Bologna towards the end of the 17th century. So this instrument was already around because it has no string winding, wound strings. They're all gut strings. The bottom string on this is a C, the same as a cello. And the top string is a G, which is a note below the cello's A. So the strings are tuned like a guitar, kind of. There's a third. So they're fourths, but with a third. And it's a cousin of the guitar. The viola-da-gamba is derived from the word vihuela, which is the same word as guitar in Portuguese still, I think, is vihuela. Anyway, they're cousins. And it has frets on it, tied around the neck with gut. So, yes, this instrument would have belonged as a bass instrument, whereas the cello had arrived. And so what you did with this, and you could of course have a bigger one of these. You could have a violone at the same tuning but bigger, and if it was big enough you would add a sixth string. This has 5, and that sixth string would be a G, a low G, which would bring it down to exactly the same low G as that 3-string double bass on the floor. Hard to believe because the sound is so different, the timbre is so different, but it's the same. That's the same pitch. The G below the cello is how low double basses were expected to go, and indeed how low this instrument could go if it had its 6th string, and that depends on how big it's made. Players of this instrument would have been accustomed to playing this role of continuo bass, and would have done all the tricks that players still are required to do, which involve interpreting the score to suit the occasion. Actually, I want to just divert. I suppose I'm diverting from where I was by interrupting myself and confusing you even more, but that's fine too. In general, there is an awful lot of scholarship. There's loads of scholarship about the word violone and what it means, because all of Bach's double bass parts say violone. That's true of all the cantatas where there is a separate part. Very often there isn't, so you'll have basso or continuo, and continuo is the bass line, and it's played by double basses as required, cellos, bassoons. Bach will usually specify what he wants. You might harpsichord, organ. With Bach, if he doesn't say it, he doesn't want it. But other composers, you might add other things to it. If you go back a bit earlier, I did an opera 20 years ago in Dublin. Was it the Irish Baroque or Christchurch Baroque? I don't even know. It was 20 years ago anyway, I know that. And it was by a Venetian composer, Cavalli. And it says here he was born in 1602. So this is early 17th century stuff. And this Cavalli opera was typical of the Venetian style at the time, which was that it was mostly about melody. And the score, this was a large opera, Erismena was the name, big full opera. The score was mostly 2 lines of music, like a piano part, you know, like a treble clef and a bass clef. And yes, if you had simply taken what was written there and performed it, you would have had a singer and a bass player playing along. I suppose there were figures in the bass, but actually I'm not sure if it was even figured now that I think of it. I think David Adams had to do all the figuring. So you had literally a vocal line and a bass line. Maybe he only had to do the figuring for bits of it. Anyway, most of the opera was written like that. And yet, in the Continuo section, so that bass clef part, playing off that bass clef, we had a harpsichord and an organ and a harp and I'm pretty sure we had a theorbo and a viola-da-gamba. Did I say double bass? Also cello. So anyway, about 7 people playing this one line. So instead of 2 lines of music, you now have a whole band. Now maybe 7 of them are playing off the same line. So what you do with that? Well, you use that to color this line. These are choices to made with reference to as much historical information as you can get. And then ultimately, really once you absorb the information, the director makes his choices. You can color the Continuo so that it's certain characters come on stage and the color of the accompaniment changes. So it's still that one line of bass music, but you might actually remove the keyboards and only have a harp. That'll completely change things. I mean, normally the keyboards play pretty continuously, but you could even remove all of the chordal instruments, the harp, the theorbo, the organ, and the harpsichord, and you could even have a moment where you simply have a singer accompanied by a cello or a viola-da-gamba or something. These sort of dramatic possibilities, or you have everybody playing together because the drama requires that, and that's how that music was colored. And this is one of the things that make Continuo fascinating. I should admit that Continuo is the word generally applied to the line, and what I play off as a double bass player is that Continuo line. But the Generalbass, which was the nifty title for this chat, the Generalbass is in fact properly means the figured bass and the harmony instruments playing the figured bass, and it's general because the figures, the numbers above the notes, represent the harmony, which represents absolutely everything else that happens in the score. So I admit that the title for this may have been a slightly overstepping my role, but it seemed like a nice title for a bass player to be a general bass player, which is what I am, in a sense. So getting back to Cavalli, at times in this piece he did have 2 violins. So now and again in this opera, you would have 4 lines of music. You would have the singing, the vocal line, 2 violin lines, and the bass line. But of course the bass line might have been 7 of us or 6. I don't quite remember. But the 2 violin parts, that was a special effect when they came in. Mostly they sat around doing nothing, which is hilarious because modern music, all of our contemporary, orchestral music, contemporary, I mean these centuries, all our music features violins nearly all the time, but not then. They had to be prodded to wake up when it was time for them to play again. So there you go. That's general bass and colouring. Now Bach was different from this because Bach did specify quite clearly. He even specified when he wanted bassoons, which wasn't common. And people do sometimes add bassoons, even though Bach didn't ask for them. And probably that's totally legitimate because it always depended on circumstances. What players did you have available? If you had a really good bassoon player, and there were definitely types of bassoon player. The bassoon was an instrument that eventually became really refined, and Peter Whelan would talk to you about for probably about 3 hours. You could give him to talk about the bassoon, the refined, what do you call it? Anyway, whatever he calls it. But the the bassoonists and bassoons got much more sophisticated, but sometimes they were simply used because the organ was under repair or part of it, the part of the organ was not working, so you add a bassoon because it adds some of that sustained wind content. But bassoons in the Continuo line, the more refined Frenchified bassoon, because I think there was a kind of a distinction between the old fagot and the bassone, or the basson, which was elevated by French players, I believe. Anyway, that doesn't matter. But when you have two oboes in your music, it's really lovely to have the Continuo by bassoon, whether it's written or not, and sometimes it is, but even if it's not, I think we are justified in adding a bassoon and removing the cello, the almost ubiquitous cello from a Continuo line, because it's a beautiful texture and they all have the same technology of reed, the double reed. So that is that's enough about that. Well, that's not quite enough about that because I'm not sure where I am, but I'll keep talking. So another reason why we can tell about whether violone part was intended to be at what we call 6-foot pitch, which is, 8-foot pitch, which is about the length of organ pipes. 8-foot pitch is the pitch of this thing, because this C, let's see here, would require an 8-foot organ pipe. And so this kind of an instrument, which includes a cello, would be called an 8-foot instrument. And the double bass, this one here, would be called a 16-foot instrument because it goes down. If you have a low C, which you don't, it would be an octave below that. The pipe would be 16 foot long. So the organ would go down to that, and that would be the fundamental pitch of your organ, would be that 16-foot pipe. This G belongs in the 16-foot register because it's lower than this C, which is the 8-foot C. So anything lower than this C is in the 16-foot register, even though I don't go to the actual C. That C is represented in Bach's first Brandenburg concerto. That low C, the 16-foot C, is in the part labeled violone grosso. But it's very unlikely, and hundreds of people will disagree with me, and hundreds of others will agree with me, that it's very unlikely that the player had that low C. So even though it's written violone grosso in that first Brandenburg concerto, the player wouldn't have played the notes that are written. He would have put some of them up an octave higher. So why did Bach not write that, if that's the case? And I'm not saying 100% that it is, but that's my belief. The reason he didn't write exactly what the instrument could play is because the players themselves were accustomed to coping with their own limitations of technique and the limitations of the instrument, which they probably didn't own. And so they had to adjust everything. And so for the composer to write exactly what the player was going to play, it would have been a waste of his time and quite possibly wouldn't suit the instrument that would have been there on the occasion if it was performed a second time. He might have known what was going to be there the first time. So what he would give the bass player is the same part as the left hand of the keyboard, the same part that the cello would play, and of course the cello could play all of it because the cello being small, nimble, having a C as its fundamental note, the cello could play all of those and played everything. That was kind of the unique selling point of the cello, was that because of its size, because of this wound metal string, and therefore it could be shorter, it was also louder. It was just a brilliant, and still is a brilliant, continuo instrument. But the player playing the double bass at the 16-foot pitch would have adjusted the part, and it was much easier to just give them the part and say, look, do what you need to do with that. And that's what they would have done. And so just because you see a low C in the part doesn't mean you have to go out and buy a double bass with some kind of an extension or an extra string, or maybe if you want to use plain gut strings, maybe you have to have a bass that's up to the ceiling so that it'll make that noise. I'm afraid it doesn't. However, it does, your choice of instrument should be based on some musical things, such as if you find that the instrument you're playing, moves from to be more than an octave below the 8-foot line, which is the line that the cello is playing on the left hand of the keyboard. If, because you're doubling an octave lower, you find yourself extra low, it won't happen obviously if you're just doubling, because then you are literally following the contour. But if you have a separate violone part, and that separate violone part ends up taking you more than an octave away from the cello, you're probably on the wrong violone, meaning you're in the wrong octave and you should be playing one of these smaller instruments. And I'm going to, I guess I'm going to, is there anything else I wanted to do? Well, I've talked about Bach. I haven't talked about 100 million things, and I probably need to lie down now actually and recover. I don't know, should I play you something on this gamba? I think I will. I think I'll just take, can I take just a few minutes to play you the difference between these? Just because it won't take long. So this is what you might call a violone, because it's at the pitch of a violone. Now they could come bigger than this and possibly smaller. This is probably about as small as it could come. G at the top, C at the bottom. Okay, now this thing here is definitely not a violone, although as you can see it's exactly the same size. So why is it not the same thing? Well, this is another reason to be confused, that the size of an instrument is not the defining characteristic. Which bow will I use? This one. So this one sounds like this. This one goes down to a D, almost as low as this C, but the sound is completely different, and the top string is much higher. That's a D. So this is in fact what you would call a normal viola-da-gamba, tuned in the key of D, and they're usually smaller than this. But I like them big, so I have a big one. And because I have a big one, I don't need to have metal winding on my strings, which you will find on smaller and on most viola-da-gambas. But the quality of that is a valuable thing. The quality of the darkness of that thick gut, and like the 3-string bass, which I far prefer to getting into wound metal strings, the chuff that you get from that bottom string, in fact, hangs together with the chuff you get from a Baroque bassoon, which has a lot of front to the note like that, and the chuff that you get from a chamber organ. Every note starts with the kind of chuff, chuff. It's quite remarkable, and seems like some kind of cosmic alignment that this same front to the note comes from a reed, a keyboard instrument, and a bowed string instrument. But there you go, and it is a fact that Baroque instruments in general all blend in a way that modern instruments don't. And modern instruments have all become supercharged versions of themselves. And a modern oboe sounds so oboe-y that you couldn't possibly mistake it for anything else. But a Baroque oboe can blend in and kind of hide and then emerge from the texture, and you think, there's the oboe, and he was there all the time. And it's because modern instruments have become beefed up and more, they become heightened versions of themselves, which is a good thing. But in the terms of ensemble, it's one of the beautiful things about the Baroque instruments is how they fit together. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. I think are there any questions?
There are indeed. Thank you, Malachy, so much for illuminating all of the possibilities. Well, quite literally illuminating, actually, for part of your talk there.
Are you very confused?
Thank you. It was really, really super, absolutely fascinating. We do have a number of questions for you. So the first one is, how do you adapt your continuo playing according to acoustics? So if you're touring a piece and you're in a very boomy cathedral one night and a dry theatre the next, are there changes that you have to make to your approach as a continuo player?
Absolutely, yes. And actually the double bass in particular, if you're playing that 16-foot roll, because you're not expected to play all the notes, whereas the cellist is kind of obliged to. You can really help in that respect. Not just help the listener, but help the players too, because it can be hard in a really swimmy acoustic if the music is busy, it can be hard for the players to hear each other because they're busy lines overlapping. And so what the bass player can do, and what I do, is I will just leave out some notes and punctuate and play more of the beats and leave out some of the stuff. Whereas in a drier acoustic, you can play more of those notes. Actually, this raises another question very briefly, which is, should you play all the notes? If the player at the time was playing with a glove on because his fingers were soft and playing an instrument he didn't own and probably didn't have a lot of technique, if you happen to have had the luxury of studying the double bass for years as a specialist and can play the notes, should you do it? In the end, it comes down to exactly this choice, Alia, which is what does the music need?
Thank you. That's really interesting. Yes, it's something that we don't have to think about in other parts of the orchestra in quite the same way. Certainly, we're not faced with those sorts of choices. And it's interesting to hear those calculations. The next question is, does it take you time to adjust between viol family instruments and violin family instruments? Particularly, I suppose, with the bow hold, that you're underhand, aren't you, for the viol family, and then overhand for the...
Yeah. It does, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. So if you played one instrument forever and then you started learning a second one, it would be hard. It's the same as languages. People who speak several languages, which I don't, say that after you learn 3 languages, the 4th is easy. And it's a bit like that. Peter mentioned it last week, the difference between overwhelmed and what was the word he used? Omniwhelmed or something. Was that the word he used? That one challenge can be overwhelming, but if you're just generally whelmed, then you kind of get on with it. There are a number of different bow holds, which is fun, right? So this gamba bow hold, you have your finger on the hair, which allows you to connect in a nice way with the string because you're touching the hair. But then there's this different gamba bow hold, and this bow works better this way, which is a Renaissance hold where you have all your fingers on the stick and you don't touch the hair at all, but you're still underneath it. And then this one here is the standard underhand German style Baroque hold, where you're that's kind of different because the frog is so massive and it's a bit like a saw. And then there's and then this one here. This is an overhand bow that I use on the double bass when playing lighter and faster, nimbler stuff. It's a smaller bow, and I hold this one exactly like a cello bow. So there's all of those different bows, and they just take different. They work in different ways, and it's fun. It's really good fun.
Fantastic, thank you. We have the next question actually is from Keith Pascoe. It's more of a philosophical question for you. He's wondering what you think about historically informed performance informed by previous generations of performers rather than previous generations of academics or theorists.
Yeah, that's a good question. Hi there, Keith. As I understand it, there was a generation, a kind of a first wave of historical performers who were totally turned on by the research. And many of them were charismatic performers, but nevertheless, the performance was not the main point for a lot of them. And the research was really what intrigued them. So then that made way for a second generation of early music specialists who didn't have to do all the research. And now some of them did, of course, but if you weren't turned on by the research, because of the work of the first generation, and I'm talking mid-20th century, because of their work, you could be turned on by the music, by the sound, because you now had it. You hadn't had the sound until those people did the work. So the second generation maybe involved a lot of people who actually didn't want to read any stuff because they weren't turned on by that. They were attracted by the sound. I think now, at the moment, we're in a stage where there's a lot of people who are both, who are really, really accomplished performers, often even having studied at conservatoires now, you couldn't do that until very recently to study specifically as your first study to study a Baroque style, a Baroque instrument in Baroque style. So my answer to you, Keith, is what do I think of them is I cannot give you a blanket opinion. I think that there's room for performers who don't want to study. I absolutely think there is room for that. And I myself did a master's degree in historical musicology, and I did that because I wanted to put my toe in the water of that kind of deep scholarship. But in the course of doing that master's degree, I admitted to myself absolutely that I wasn't an academic, nor did I want to be an academic, that I wanted to be a performer, and that my main effort should remain in performing. So while I will read, and I do read, and I enjoy to read, I'm also absolutely happy to call up somebody I know is an expert and ask, what do I do with this? How do I do this? Is this acceptable? And I'll take their word for it because I trust that they've done the scholarship. Now that may seem lazy, but the fact is you can't do everything. And so if you put your effort into performing, which that has been my choice, then you admit that you don't know everything. The fact is, even if you've done all the research, you don't know everything. And somebody comes along tomorrow and proves you wrong anyway.
That's a very open answer. Thank you. I like that. I do like the idea that with historically informed performance now, that it's always evolving somehow. There are still new ideas coming into the mix. It's such an exciting scene. Thank you. One more for you before we wrap up. It's out of all of the genres of music that you encounter, both through work and play, do you have a particular kind of music that's your favorite out of everything that you do?
No, I play modern string orchestra music, lots of chamber music. I love that. I play new music. I love new music, contemporary music, because it's a crazy adventure, and a lot of what we're given is unplayable or virtually unplayable, and that's a great adventure. What you do with this, and some of it that is playable is only playable after you've acquired some new technique that you didn't have before. So that's fascinating. I absolutely love Baroque music, Baroque repertoire, and pre-Baroque Renaissance music. I grew up in a house with a lot of Renaissance music. My parents were into that, and that music is maybe that's my favorite. Not that I play a lot of it, but that's home for me. Is dance tunes from 16th century. I fell asleep in my bed as a kid to that music. But I love songs. I love pop songs. I love folk songs. The only thing I don't like is music that's fake. If it's real, and if the players are playing with sincerity, I like that.
Thank you so much. So that takes us to the end of our time for this evening. Thank you so much for showing us all of these instruments and for taking us into the sound world of each one. It's been really, really interesting. And thank you to everyone who sent in questions today. We're hugely grateful to the NCH for partnering with us on this series and for facilitating the technological side. For those of you who'd like to join us next Tuesday at 7 o'clock, violinist Maria Gaynor will be exploring the links between folk and Baroque in her talk entitled Baroque Bows and Folk Fiddles. So I hope very much that we'll see you there. Thank you.